The afternoon light slanted through the study windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug I had vacuumed 3 times that week. I moved my cloth along the mahogany bookshelf, erasing dust that had barely had time to settle. My hands working in the rhythm I had perfected over 2 years of employment in Marco Vitale's household. Invisible, efficient, silent. These were the qualities that kept a maid employed in a house where men spoke of things that could get people killed. I heard them before I saw them, 2 voices low and careful, coming from the hallway that led to the service entrance. I recognized them immediately. Enzo and Sal, the bodyguards who stood outside Mr. Vitale's study door whenever he conducted business. The same men who had never once acknowledged my existence beyond a dismissive glance. I pressed myself against the bookshelf, my body going still the way it had learned to go still years ago, in another life, in a house where stillness meant survival. The IA voices grew clearer as they approached, stopping just outside the partially open door. "Tonight," Enzo said, "during the dinner with the Castellanos, he'll be distracted trying to close the deal. And the girl? The daughter?" Sal's voice carried a note of something that made my stomach clench. "Collateral. Ricci wants her alive. Says she's worth more breathing than not. Vitale won't go down easy. He won't have to go down at all if we do it right. Poison in the wine. Slow acting. By the time he realizes something's wrong, we'll have the girl in the car and be halfway to Ricci's compound." I stopped breathing. My hand froze on the cloth, my fingers white around the fabric. Marco Vitale was many things, most of them whispered about in tones of fear and reverence. He ran this city's underworld with an iron grip that had never loosened in the 15 years since he took over from his father. Men did not cross him and live to speak of it, but these men, his own guards, were planning to cross him tonight, and they were talking about a girl, his daughter. I had seen her twice, a solemn child of 8 with her father's dark eyes and her dead mother's delicate features. She lived in the East Wing with her nanny, kept separate from the business that consumed the rest of the house. I had cleaned her room once when her regular maid was sick, had noticed the stuffed rabbit on her bed that was worn thin from holding, the drawings taped to her wall that showed a family of 3 with a dark-haired woman in every picture. The footsteps retreated down the hallway. I did not move for a long moment, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would give me away. Then, slowly, I released my grip on the cloth and looked at the clock on the mantel. 3:40 in the afternoon. The dinner with the Castellanos was scheduled for 8. I had 4 hours. The logical thing to do was nothing. I was nobody, a 26-year-old maid with no family, no connections, no power to stop what was coming. I had learned long ago that survival meant keeping my head down and my mouth shut. It meant not seeing things, not hearing things, not knowing things that could get me killed. I had rebuilt my life on that principle after everything I had lost, after the night that had stripped me of everyone I loved and left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a scar that ran from my collarbone to my shoulder, hidden beneath the uniform I wore. But there was a child in this house. A little girl who slept with a stuffed rabbit and drew pictures of her dead mother. A little girl whose only crime was being born to a man who had made enemies. I thought of another little girl, one who had existed 7 years ago, who had watched men burn down everything she loved and had survived only because she had been small enough to hide in a space they did not think to check. I thought of the promise I had made to myself in the ashes of that life, the promise that I would never again be the person who did nothing while innocent people suffered. I set down my cleaning supplies and walked out of the study. Finding Marco Vitale in his own house was not a simple matter. He kept irregular hours, moving between meetings and phone calls in the private office where even the senior staff were rarely permitted to enter. But I had spent 2 years learning the patterns of this house, the rhythms and routines that governed its inhabitants. I knew that on Tuesday afternoons Mr. Vitale took his coffee in the library while reviewing financial reports. I knew that he preferred to be alone during this time, that even his most trusted advisors waited outside until he summoned them. I also knew that interrupting him uninvited was grounds for immediate termination, and possibly something worse. The library door was solid oak, polished to a shine by hands that were not mine. I had never cleaned this room. It fell under the purview of the senior housekeeping staff, women who had been with the family for decades and who looked at new maids like me with barely concealed suspicion. I stood outside that door for a full 30 seconds, my hand raised to knock, my courage wavering. Then I thought of the little girl with the stuffed rabbit, and I knocked. "Enter." The voice was cold and flat, carrying no warmth or welcome. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through heavy curtains. The library was vast, its walls lined with books that looked too old to touch, its furniture arranged around a massive fireplace that held nothing but cold ashes. And in a leather chair by the window sat Marco Vitale, a coffee cup in one hand and a stack of papers in the other, his dark eyes lifting to meet mine with an expression of such complete indifference that I almost lost my nerve entirely. He was 52 years old, though he looked younger when he wasn't frowning, which was rarely. His hair was silver at the temples, black everywhere else, swept back from a face that would have been handsome if it weren't so hard. He wore a charcoal suit despite being in his own home, his shirt crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, every inch of him radiating the controlled power that made men twice his size step carefully around him. I had never spoken to him directly in 2 years of employment. I had barely been in the same room with him. And now I was standing in his private sanctuary, uninvited, about to deliver news that would either save his life or end mine. "You're not Mrs. Chen," he observed, setting down his papers with the deliberate slowness of a man who was rarely surprised and did not appreciate the occasions when he was. "No, sir. My name is Elena Reyes. I'm on the housekeeping staff." "I know who you are." His eyes moved over me with clinical assessment, cataloguing and dismissing in the same glance. "What I don't know is why you're in my library when you should be cleaning the West Wing." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I need to tell you something, sir, about your bodyguards, about Enzo and Sal." Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. The indifference remained, but beneath it, I sensed a tension sharpening like a blade being honed. He did not speak, did not invite me to continue, simply watched me with those flat, dark eyes, and waited. "I overheard them talking," I said, "in the hallway outside your study. They're planning to poison you tonight, during the dinner with the Castellanos. And they're going to take your daughter to someone named Ricci." The silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever experienced. It pressed against my skin like a physical weight, made it difficult to draw breath. Marco Vitale's face betrayed nothing, not shock, not fear, not even anger. He simply sat there motionless, his coffee cup still in his hand, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. I did not look away. After what felt like an eternity, he set down his coffee cup with a soft click of porcelain against wood. When he spoke, his voice was exactly as flat and cold as before, as if I had told him the weather was changing rather than that his most trusted guards were plotting to murder him. "How much of the conversation did you hear?" "All of it, I think. They mentioned tonight during the dinner, poison in the wine. They said your daughter would be collateral, that Ricci wants her alive. And you came directly to me with this information." "Yes, sir. Without telling anyone else. Without going to Enzo or Sal themselves, or to Mrs. Chen, or to my head of security. I didn't know who to trust, sir. They're your bodyguards. If they're traitors, then anyone could be." His eyes narrowed fractionally, and for the first time, I saw something other than cold assessment in his gaze. It might have been interest. It might have been suspicion. It might have been both. "You didn't think about the risk to yourself? Coming to me with accusations against men who have been with this family for 8 years? "I thought about it, sir. And you came anyway. Your daughter is 8 years old." My voice came out steadier than I expected. She has a stuffed rabbit she sleeps with every night. She draws pictures of her mother. She deserves the chance to grow up. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less weighted with threat, more weighted with something I couldn't quite identify. Marco Vitale rose from his chair, unfolding to his full height, with the easy grace of a man who had never known a moment of physical weakness. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of someone who had not let age or luxury soften him. He walked toward me with slow, measured steps, and I held my ground even as every instinct screamed at me to retreat. He stopped less than a foot away, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that reminded me of cedar and smoke, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. "What's your name again?" "Eleanor Reyes, sir." "Eleanor?" He said it like he was tasting the word, testing its weight on his tongue. "You've been with us for 2 years." "Yes, sir." "In that time, you've never once drawn attention to yourself, never asked for special treatment, never complained, never involved yourself in matters beyond your station. Mrs. Chen's reports on your work are exemplary. You arrive early, leave late, and speak to no one unless spoken to first." I said nothing because there was nothing to say. Everything he had described was true and intentional. "And now, without any guarantee of reward or safety, you've walked into my private library to tell me that 2 of my most senior guards are planning to kill me and kidnap my daughter." His head tilted slightly, his expression still unreadable. "Why?" "Because it was the right thing to do, sir." "The right thing to do?" He repeated my words back to me with a faint edge that might have been mockery or might have been something else. "In my experience, people rarely act based on what's right. They act based on what benefits them." "Then perhaps your experience has been limited, sir." The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and I watched something flicker across his face, something that might have been surprise or might have been the beginning of anger. I braced myself for whatever came next, for dismissal or punishment or worse. Instead, he did something I did not expect. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not even a particularly friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just noticed that his prey was more interesting than he had anticipated. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Elena Reyes." "Perhaps both, sir." "Perhaps." He turned away from me, walking toward a panel on the far wall that I had always assumed was decorative. His fingers pressed against it in a sequence too quick for me to follow, and a section of the wall slid open to reveal a hidden room beyond. "Come with me." I hesitated, my survival instincts screaming warnings that I could not ignore. Going into a hidden room with Marco Vitale, a man who had reportedly made more people disappear than the police had records for, was not a decision to be made lightly. "If I wanted you dead, you would be dead already," he said without looking at me. "The fact that we're still having this conversation should tell you something about your current circumstances." It was not reassurance exactly, but it was close enough. I followed him through the panel and into a room that looked like something from a spy movie, all monitors and equipment and blinking lights that I could not begin to identify. A man I had never seen before sat at a central console, his fingers flying over a keyboard, his attention shifting to us as we entered. "Marco," he said, a greeting that suggested familiarity and possibly friendship, which struck me as strange. I had not known Marco Vitale had friends. "Domenico, I need you to pull up the security feeds from the hallway outside my study, timestamp approximately 3:30 this afternoon." Domenico's eyebrows rose, but he turned back to his console without asking questions. Within seconds, footage appeared on the central monitor, grainy but clear enough to show 2 figures standing in the hallway, their heads bent together in conversation. Enzo and Sal. "Audio?" Marco asked. "Give me a second." More keystrokes, and then their voices filled the room, exactly as I had heard them less than an hour ago. I watched Marco's face as he listened to his own men discussing his murder and his daughter's abduction, watched the complete absence of expression that somehow conveyed more fury than any visible anger could have. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute. "Leave us," Marco said to Domenico. The other man nodded once and left through a door I had not noticed, leaving me alone with Marco Vitale in a room full of secrets. He stood with his back to me, his hands braced against the console, his shoulders tense beneath the expensive fabric of his suit. "You understand," he said finally, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it, "that what you've done today has changed things for both of us. I understand that your daughter won't be taken tonight, sir. That's what matters." He turned to face me and something in his expression had shifted. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by an intensity that made my breath catch. "Tonight's dinner will proceed as planned. Enzo and Sal will not know that their plot has been discovered until it's too late for them to warn their employer. And you," he paused, his eyes boring into mine, "will not return to your cleaning duties. Sir, you've involved yourself in matters beyond your station, Elena. That can't be undone. As of this moment, you're a liability and an asset, and I don't let either of those out of my sight." The implications of his words settled over me like a weight. I had known, walking into that library, that there would be consequences for what I was about to do. I had simply not anticipated this particular consequence. "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying that you'll stay close to me until this situation is resolved. You'll tell me everything you know about the workings of this household. Every conversation you've overheard, every irregularity you've noticed. And in return, I will ensure that Ricci and anyone else involved in this plot never learns that you were the one who exposed them. And after, when the situation is resolved," his smile returned, that predator's smile that contained no warmth. "That depends entirely on you, Elena. On whether you continue to prove yourself as valuable as you have today." I looked at him, this man who held the power of life and death over everyone, in this house. This man whose guards had been willing to murder him and steal his child. This man who had just offered me protection and a place at his side in exchange for my continued usefulness. I should have been afraid. I should have been looking for a way out, for a way to return to my invisible existence and pretend this conversation had never happened. Instead, I felt something I had not felt in 7 years, since the night that had destroyed my old life and forced me to build a new one from the ashes. I felt seen. "I'll tell you everything I know, sir," I said. "But I have one condition." His eyebrows rose, the only indication of surprise. "You're in no position to make conditions. Your daughter. When this is over, I want to know that she's safe. Not just tonight, but always. I want to know that what I've done today means something beyond one prevented tragedy." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Isabella's safety is the only thing I care about in this world. If your information proves accurate, if tonight ends the way I intend it to, then you have my word that she will be protected for the rest of her life." His voice dropped lower, carrying a weight of conviction that I felt in my bones. "And so will you." The dinner proceeded exactly as planned. From my new position outside the dining room door, hidden but present at Marco's explicit instruction, I watched Enzo and Sal perform their duties with the ease of men who believed they were in control. They poured the wine. They stood at attention when the Castellano delegation arrived. They gave no indication that anything was different about tonight. But everything was different. Marco had assembled his true loyalists in the hours since our conversation, men whose allegiance had been tested and proven over decades rather than years. Domenico coordinated security from his hidden room, tracking every movement within the house through cameras that Enzo and Sal had never known existed. Other guards, ones I had never seen before, positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the property, waiting for the signal that would end the traitor's plot before it could begin. I watched Marco through the crack in the doorway, watched him play the role of gracious host with a skill that bordered on artistry. He smiled at the Castellano patriarch. He discussed business with the appropriate mixture of firmness and flexibility. He raised his glass in toast after toast, each time bringing it to his lips without drinking, the poisoned wine untouched by his mouth. When the main course was served, he excused himself to check on a matter in the kitchen. The real purpose of his absence became clear moments later when two sharp sounds echoed from the hallway, muffled enough that the dinner guests barely noticed, loud enough that I recognized them for what they were. Enzo and Sal would not be standing guard outside Marco Vitale's study anymore. The dinner concluded successfully. The Castellanos signed the agreement Marco had been pursuing. The guests departed with handshakes and promises of future cooperation. And through it all I remained in my hidden position, invisible and watchful, exactly as I had always been. Except now, I was invisible by choice rather than by necessity. And I was watching for Marco Vitale, not despite him. He found me after the last car had pulled away, standing in the shadowed alcove where I had spent the last 4 hours. His jacket was gone, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He looked different like this, less polished and more human, though the cold control in his eyes remained unchanged. "It's done," he said. "Ricci has been informed that his plan failed, and that any future attempts against my family will be met with consequences he cannot afford." "And Enzo and Sal?" "Being questioned. They'll provide the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy before the night is over." His voice carried no hesitation, no regret. These were men who had broken his trust and threatened his daughter. Whatever fate awaited them was simply the cost of their betrayal. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you tell me about yourself, Elena Reyes. The real story, not the fiction in your employment file." I stiffened, my hands clenching at my sides. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "You're not a career servant. Your hands are too soft, your posture too careful, your vocabulary too precise. You flinch at sudden sounds but not at the sight of blood. You knew exactly how to move through this house unnoticed, how to gather information without drawing attention, how to assess a threat and respond appropriately." He stepped closer, his eyes searching my face. "Who are you, really? And who taught you to survive like this?" I could have lied. I could have maintained the fiction that had protected me for 2 years. The story of a poor girl from the South Side who had nothing and no one, and wanted only to work hard and be left alone. But Marco Vitale had just trusted me with the lives of himself and his daughter. He had kept his word and protected me when he could have easily disposed of me as a potential security risk. He deserved truth in return. "My name isn't Elena Reyes," I said quietly. "It's Valentina Marino. 7 years ago, my father was the accountant for the Benedetto family. He discovered that Carmine Benedetto was skimming from his own people, hiding money in accounts that only my father could access. He was going to expose the theft, take the evidence to the other families, let them judge Carmine for his crimes." "The Benedetto massacre," Marco said, his voice flat with recognition. 23 people killed in a single night. The news called it a gang war. It wasn't a gang war. It was extermination. Carmine found out about my father's plans and decided to eliminate everyone who might have been told about the theft. My parents, my brothers, my aunts and uncles and cousins, everyone. But you survived? I was 15, small for my age. When the shooting started, my mother pushed me into a crawl space beneath the stairs, the kind that's meant for storing holiday decorations. She told me to stay quiet no matter what I heard. She told me she loved me. And then she went back out there and I never saw her again. The words came out flat and empty, drained of the emotion that had once accompanied them. 7 years of grief had worn grooves in my memory, turning sharp agony into dull ache, fresh wounds into old scars. I had told this story to no one since the night it happened. I had built an entire new identity specifically to ensure that I would never have to tell it. But Marco Vitale was looking at me with something in his eyes that I did not expect. Not pity, which would have been unbearable. Not skepticism, which would have been easier to dismiss. Understanding, as if he knew exactly what it meant to survive when everyone you loved did not. Carmine Benedetto died 4 years ago, he said. Heart attack. Very sudden. I know. Do you also know that it wasn't actually a heart attack? I met his eyes, something cold and satisfied settling in my chest. I suspected. He made a lot of enemies in his time, people with long memories and longer reach. His death was a message to anyone else who might consider breaking faith with their own families. A message from whom? Marco's smile was thin and sharp. From people who believe that loyalty is sacred, that family is sacred, that certain crimes deserve certain consequences no matter how long it takes to deliver them. I understood what he was telling me, even though he had not said it directly. Marco Vitale, or someone working on his behalf, had been involved in Carmine Benedetto's death. The man who had murdered my entire family had been eliminated by the man in whose house I now stood, before I had ever known either of them existed. You didn't do it for me, I said. You didn't even know I existed. No, but the result is the same. The man who destroyed your life is dead. And you've spent 7 years surviving, hiding, waiting for something you couldn't even name. He reached out, his fingers brushing my chin, tilting my face up to meet his gaze. You don't have to hide anymore, Valentina. Not from me. No one had called me by my real name since my mother whispered it in the darkness before she died. The sound of it now, in this stranger's voice, cracked something open inside me that I had not known was still sealed. I felt tears burning behind my eyes and forced them back through sheer will. I've been Elena Reyes for 7 years, I said. I don't know if I remember how to be anyone else. Then learn, starting tonight. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of changed routines and new realities. I was no longer assigned to the housekeeping staff. My small room in the servants' quarters was replaced by a guest suite in the main house, with windows that looked out over the gardens and a bathroom larger than my previous entire living space. Mrs. Chen was told that I had been promoted to a special assistant position, a fiction that satisfied curiosity without inviting questions. In truth, I was being trained. Marco had decided, for reasons he did not explain and I did not ask, that I would be useful to him in capacities beyond scrubbing floors and dusting shelves. I was introduced to Domenico properly, learned that he was Marco's cousin and chief intelligence officer, the man responsible for knowing everything about everyone who might pose a threat to the Vitale organization. I sat in on meetings where men discussed things that would have sent me running a month ago. I read reports and analysed patterns and offered observations that were sometimes dismissed and sometimes considered. And slowly, carefully, I began to understand the world I had entered. The Vitale family was not the largest criminal organisation in the city, but it was the oldest and the most respected. Marco's grandfather had established it during Prohibition, built it on principles of loyalty and honour that seemed almost quaint in the modern era. Marco himself had inherited control after his father's death 20 years ago and had spent the intervening decades consolidating power, eliminating threats, and building a network of legitimate businesses that made the family nearly untouchable by law enforcement. He was ruthless when necessary and merciful when possible, a combination that inspired both fear and devotion in his people. He did not tolerate betrayal, as Enzo and Sal had learned to their permanent regret, but he rewarded loyalty with a generosity that bordered on the feudal, treating his inner circle as extended family rather than employees. I watched him from my new position at the edges of his world, noting the way he carried himself, The way he spoke to subordinates, the way his entire demeanour shifted when his daughter entered the room. Isabella had been told nothing about the events of that Tuesday evening. She knew only that some of her father's guards had left suddenly and that a new woman had appeared in the house, a woman who sometimes sat with her during lunch and listened to her stories about school and friends and the rabbit she had named Mr. Whiskers. I liked Isabella. She was quiet and observant like her father, but beneath the solemnity, there was a brightness that reminded me of who I might have been if my childhood had ended differently. I found myself looking forward to our meals together, to the way she would chatter about her day while I ate and listened and occasionally ask questions that made her think. Marco noticed my attachment to his daughter. He noticed everything. But he said nothing about it until nearly 3 weeks after the dinner with the Castellanos, when he summoned me to his study for a conversation that would change things yet again. "Isabella asks about you when you're not there," he said, standing by the window with his back to me. "She wants to know why you're different from the other staff, why you talk to her like she's a person instead of a china doll." "She is a person, sir. A very intelligent one. She deserves to be treated accordingly." Most adults don't see it that way. They see the daughter of Marco Vitale, a potential target or a potential asset, and they adjust their behaviour accordingly. I'm not most adults. No. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable as always. "You're not. Which is why I'm going to make you an offer, Valentina, and I want you to consider it carefully before you respond." I waited, my heart beating faster despite my efforts to remain calm. Isabella needs someone. Not a nanny, she's too old for that. Not a governess, she's too smart for that. She needs a companion. Someone who will protect her, guide her, help her understand the world she's been born into without losing herself in the process. He paused, his eyes holding mine. "I want that someone to be you." "Sir, I'm not qualified. You survived the destruction of your entire family at 15 years old. You rebuilt your life from nothing, created an identity so convincing that my own security team never questioned it, and walked into my library to save my life without any guarantee of reward or safety. You're more qualified than anyone I could hire. You barely know me. I know enough." He crossed the room to stand before me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I know that you're brave and intelligent and loyal to people who haven't earned it. I know that my daughter lights up when you walk into a room. I know that in 3 weeks of observation, you've identified security vulnerabilities that my own people missed for years. That's just... I know," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "that you watch me when you think I'm not looking, that your breath catches when I stand too close, that whatever else you feel about this situation, about me, you're not indifferent." My face flushed hot with mortification. I had thought I was being careful, thought my attention was unnoticed in the bustle of meetings and meals and daily routines. But Marco Vitale noticed everything, and apparently that included the inappropriate fascination I had been trying desperately to suppress. "Sir, I would never—" "Marco." His hand came up to cup my jaw, tilting my face toward his. "My name is Marco, and I want to hear you say it. Marco." The name felt strange on my tongue, too familiar for the distance I had been trying to maintain. "I can't be Isabella's companion, and also, whatever else you're suggesting." "Why not?" "Because it would compromise my position, because people would talk, because you're afraid." His thumb brushed across my cheekbone. "Featherlight?" "Not of me. You stopped being afraid of me somewhere around the 2nd week, though you did an admirable job of pretending otherwise. You're afraid of wanting something, of letting yourself have it." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to step back, to rebuild the walls that his words were systematically dismantling, but he was right, and we both knew it. "I've lost everyone I've ever cared about," I said quietly. "Everyone. My parents, my brothers, my cousins. I watched them die, or I found out later that they were dead, and each time it felt like a piece of me was being carved away. I don't know if there's enough left to survive losing anyone else. Then don't lose them. His other hand came up to frame my face, holding me gently but firmly in place. Stay here, where I can protect you. Be there for Isabella, who needs someone like you more than she knows. And let me... He stopped, something flickering in his expression that I could not identify. Let me try to be worth the risk you've already taken. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to let me earn your trust. There's a difference. I looked at him. This man who had been a stranger 3 weeks ago and was now offering me something I had not dared to want for 7 years. A place, a purpose, a possibility of connection that terrified me as much as it tempted me. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. Any of it. I've spent so long surviving that I've forgotten how to live. Then learn. He echoed the words he had spoken on the night everything changed. Starting tonight. He kissed me then, soft and careful and nothing like I expected from a man of his reputation. His lips moved against mine with a gentleness that bordered on reverent, asking rather than taking, offering rather than demanding. I felt something crack open inside me, something that had been frozen for 7 years, warming slowly under the heat of his attention. When he pulled back, his eyes were darker than before, his breathing slightly unsteady. That's a start, he said. We have time for the rest. Time proved to be both a luxury and a teacher in the months that followed. I moved into my new role as Isabella's companion with the same dedication I had once brought to scrubbing floors. But the work was infinitely more rewarding. Isabella blossomed under consistent attention, her solemnity giving way to the curiosity and playfulness of a normal 8-year-old. We read books together, explored the gardens, had long conversations about everything from science to art to the complicated ethics of fairy tales. She asked me once about my family, her dark eyes serious in a way that reminded me painfully of her father. I told her a simplified version of the truth, that I had lost my parents when I was young, that I understood what it was like to miss someone who wasn't coming back. She nodded slowly, and then hugged me, her small arms tight around my waist, and I held her until my eyes stopped burning. Marco observed our growing bond with satisfaction that he did not trouble to hide. He joined us for meals when his schedule permitted, sat with us in the library while Isabella practiced her reading, asked questions about our days that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. His daughter adored him with the uncomplicated devotion of a child, and watching them together made something ache in my chest, something that wanted and feared in equal measure. Our own relationship progressed slowly, cautiously, nothing like the whirlwind romances in the books I sometimes read to pass the time. Marco was not a man who rushed into anything, and I was not a woman who trusted easily. We circled each other like wary animals, taking careful steps forward, occasionally retreating to safer ground, gradually mapping the territory between us. He kissed me again, many times, in shadowed corners and private moments, his hands always gentle, his attention always his, complete. He asked questions about my past and actually listened to the answers. He told me stories about his own life, about the father who had raised him to lead and the mother who had died when he was still a boy, about the wife he had loved and lost to illness 5 years ago. We talked for hours, sometimes about nothing important, sometimes about everything that mattered, building understanding one conversation at a time. But there were lines we did not cross. My suite remained in the guest wing. His bedroom remained private territory. The attraction between us was undeniable but contained, held in check by mutual agreement and the complications of our situation. "You're protecting me," I said one evening, curled beside him on the library sofa while Isabella slept upstairs. "From gossip, from assumption, from the people who would say I'm only here because of your bed. Yes, he did not pretend otherwise. Your value to this family should be evident to everyone, not questioned, because of where you sleep. My value, I tested the word, tasting its implications. Is that how you see me? As an asset? That's how I present you to others, not how I see you. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that had become familiar over the past months. How I see you is considerably more complicated. Tell me. He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. I see a woman who was forged in fire and emerged stronger than the flames. I see intelligence and courage and a capacity for love that should have been destroyed by everything you've survived but somehow wasn't. I see someone who has given my daughter hope and given me something I thought I'd lost the ability to feel. And what is that? His eyes met mine, darker than the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. Possibility. The word hung between us, weighted with everything we had not yet said, everything we were not yet ready to acknowledge. I leaned into him, letting my head rest against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my cheek. I see a man who carries the weight of an empire without complaint, I said quietly, who loves his daughter more than his own life, who could have dismissed me as a threat or a nuisance on the day we met, but chose to see something else instead. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I see someone I'm learning to trust, someone I might be able to love if I let myself. His arm tightened around me. That's all I'm asking for, Valentina, the chance to earn what you're not ready to give. Summer turned to autumn, and autumn began its slow surrender to winter. The trees in the garden shed their leaves, carpeting the paths in gold and crimson, before frost turned everything to brown and grey. Isabella started a new school year, came home with stories about friends and teachers and the complicated social dynamics of third grade. I helped her with homework, listened to her worries, celebrated her small victories with the enthusiasm they deserved. Marco's business continued in its endless cycles of meetings and negotiations, and the occasional crisis that required his personal attention. I saw less of him during busy periods, more of him during quiet ones, and learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders and the tension around his eyes. When things were difficult, I made sure there was peace waiting for him at home. When things were calm, I let myself enjoy his company without the constant awareness of threats and complications. The household accepted my presence with varying degrees of warmth. Domenico became something like a friend, his dry wit and obvious devotion to Marco making him easy to trust. Mrs. Chen remained formal but cordial, her suspicion gradually softening into grudging respect. The guards who had replaced Enzo and Sal were professional and distant, which suited me fine. There were others who were less accepting. Marco's sister Lucia, who lived in another city and visited rarely, made her disapproval clear the first time we met. She saw a maid who had gotten above herself, a gold digger capitalizing on a moment of dramatic timing. Her coldness stung, but Marco's response to it stung more. My sister's opinions are her own, he said flatly. They do not affect my decisions or your position in this house. She thinks I'm using you. She thinks everyone is using me. It's a survival mechanism from growing up in this family. She'll come around eventually or she won't. Either way, it doesn't matter. It matters to me. I don't want to cause problems between you. He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me with possessive warmth. You're not causing problems. Lucia's prejudices are causing problems. There's a difference. Winter deepened, bringing cold winds and early darkness, and the approach of holidays that I had not celebrated properly in 7 years. Marco asked what traditions my family had kept when I was young, listened to my halting descriptions of tamales and luminarias and midnight mass, and set about recreating as much of it as he could within the walls of his mansion. Isabella was enchanted by the preparations, throwing herself into decorating with enthusiasm that made the house feel warmer despite the temperatures outside. I taught her the songs my mother had taught me, showed her how to fold paper into star shapes, explained the significance of each element in ways that honored my past without drowning in grief. On Christmas Eve, after Isabella had gone to bed buzzing with anticipation, Marco led me to the room where a small altar had been set up, candles flickering around photographs I did not remember giving him. "How did you—" I started, my voice catching. "Domenico is very good at finding things. I hope you don't mind." I looked at the faces I had not seen in 7 years. My parents young and smiling, my brothers making faces at the camera, my grandmother holding an infant version of me. I felt tears sliding down my cheeks and did not try to stop them. "You gave me back my family," I whispered. "Not them, not really, but the memory of them, the acknowledgement that they existed." "They'll always exist," Marco said, standing beside me. "As long as you remember them, as long as you speak their names, they're not truly gone. That's what my mother told me before she died, and I choose to believe it." I turned to him, this man who had become so much more than I ever expected, and kissed him with everything I could not say. He responded in kind, his hands gentle on my waist, his mouth soft against mine. "I love you," I said when we finally broke apart. "I don't know when it happened. I don't know if I should admit it, but I do." His forehead pressed against mine, his breath warm on my face. "I've been waiting to hear those words for longer than you know. You could have said them first. I wanted you to be ready. I wanted you to be sure. I'm sure." And I was, more certain of this than I had been of anything in years. I'm terrified. And I'm sure. And I don't know how both of those things can be true, but they are. "Then that's enough." He kissed my forehead, my eyelids, the tear tracks on my cheeks. "That's more than enough." Spring arrived with sudden warmth and the promise of new growth, and with it came complications I should have anticipated but somehow didn't. Marco had enemies, people who resented his power or coveted his territory, or simply wanted to prove they could hurt the untouchable Vitale family. One of those enemies decided that the best way to do so was through me. I was shopping with Isabella when they made their move, picking out books in a small store that Marco had declared safe enough for carefully supervised outings. The guards stationed outside did not see the threat until it was almost too late, until a van had pulled up and men were pushing through the door, and one of them was grabbing Isabella while another was reaching for me. I did not freeze. I did not scream. I did exactly what 7 years of survival had trained me to do. I fought. The man reaching for me expected an easy target, a pampered woman with no combat skills. He was wrong. I drove my elbow into his throat, stomped on his foot, twisted free of his grip while he choked and stumbled. Then I turned to the man holding Isabella, who had frozen with fear in his arms, her face white and her eyes huge. "Let her go." He laughed, his grip tightening. "Or what?" The knife I had taken from his partner's belt was in my hand before he finished the question. I did not remember drawing it. I only knew that Isabella was in danger and that nothing else mattered. "Or I show you what happened to the last man who threatened someone I love." Something in my face must have convinced him I was serious, because his laughter died and his eyes went uncertain. Before he could decide what to do, the guards finally reached us, their weapons drawn, their training kicking in with brutal efficiency. Within seconds, both men were on the ground, alive but unlikely to enjoy the experience for much longer. I gathered Isabella into my arms, holding her tight while she sobbed against my shoulder, whispering reassurances I barely heard myself. My hands were shaking now that the danger was past, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and fear and the delayed realization of how close we had come to disaster. Marco arrived within minutes, his face pale beneath its usual composure, his eyes burning with a fury that made the captured men visibly cringe. He did not speak to them. He did not need to. The guards knew what to do, and by the time I looked up again, we were alone in the bookstore with its scattered merchandise and broken displays. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over me, checking for injuries, his touch careful despite the violence I knew was churning beneath his surface. "I'm fine. Isabella's fine. They didn't—" He pulled me into his arms, crushing me against his chest with a force that drove the breath from my lungs. I could feel him shaking, this man who controlled empires and commanded armies, trembling against me like a child. "If anything had happened to you," he said into my hair, "if I had lost you, you didn't. I'm here. We're both here. Because you fought." He pulled back enough to look at me, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "You fought for her, for yourself. You protected my daughter when I couldn't. I love her. I love you. There was nothing else I could do." He kissed me then, hard and desperate, and nothing like the careful kisses we had shared before. This was claiming and being claimed, possessing and being possessed, two people who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go. "Marry me," he said when we finally broke apart. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "What? Marry me, Valentina. Be my wife. Be Isabella's mother. Be everything you've already become, but legally, officially, in a way that no one can question or dismiss." "Marco, I'm not—" "You're everything." His hands framed my face, his eyes burning into mine. "Everything I never knew I needed. Everything I didn't know I was missing until you walked into my library and trusted me with your courage. I don't want another day to pass without the world knowing that you're mine and I'm yours. We've only been together for a few months. People will say—" "I don't care what people say. I've spent my entire life caring what people think, managing perceptions, maintaining appearances. I'm tired of it. I want you and I want everyone to know it, and if they don't like it, they can take it up with my security team." I looked at him, this man who had given me back my name and my history and my capacity for hope. This man who loved his daughter with fierce devotion and was offering to love me the same way. This man who saw me, truly saw me, and wanted me anyway. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile broke across his face like sunrise after a long night. And for the first time since I had known him, Marco Vitale looked purely, uncomplicatedly happy. The wedding was small by design, intimate by choice. Isabella served as my flower girl, her face radiant with joy that made my heart ache in the best possible way. Domenico stood as Marco's best man, his dry commentary providing welcome moments of levity during the ceremony. Even Lucia came, her disapproval softening into grudging acceptance when she saw the way her brother looked at me and the way I looked at him. I wore white because Marco wanted me to, because he saw our marriage as a new beginning rather than a continuation. I carried flowers from the garden where Isabella and I had spent so many afternoons, their fragrance filling the small chapel where generations of Vitales had been, baptized and wed, and mourned. I spoke vows that I meant with every fibre of my being, promising to love and honour and protect this family that had somehow become my own. When Marco kissed me as his wife, I felt the last of my walls crumble into dust. Whatever had survived of the girl who hid in a crawl space while her family died was finally, fully released. In her place stood a woman who had found her way through fire to something worth burning for. The months that followed were not without challenges. Marco's world was dangerous, and being his wife made me a target in ways that being his companion had not. There were threats to manage, precautions to take, moments when the weight of constant vigilance pressed down until I could barely breathe. But there was also joy, deeper and more sustaining than I had ever known. Isabella called me Mom for the first time on a quiet Tuesday evening, the word slipping out naturally and then hanging in the air while we both tried not to cry. Marco came home from difficult meetings to find me waiting, and I watched the tension drain from his shoulders as he gathered me into his arms. We built routines and traditions and inside jokes, the small intimacies that transformed a house into a home. On the first anniversary of the day I walked into Marco's library, we sat together on the terrace watching the sun set over the gardens. Isabella was inside finishing homework, her laughter occasionally drifting through the open windows. The evening was warm and golden, and I felt more at peace than I had any right to feel. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't said anything, I admitted. If I had just gone back to cleaning the West Wing and pretended I never heard those men. Then I would be dead, and Isabella would be Ricci's prisoner, and you would be living with that weight for the rest of your life. Marco's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in the gesture that had become their signature. But you did say something. You took the risk, and here we are. Here we are. I leaned into him, feeling his warmth against my side. I still don't quite believe it sometimes, that I get to have this, that it's real. It's real. He pressed a kiss to my temple. As real as anything in this world. And it will stay real for as long as we're both willing to fight for it. I'm willing. I turned to look at him. This man who had been a stranger and was now my husband, my partner, my everything. I'll always be willing. You and Isabella are worth any fight. His smile was soft in the fading light. Then we have nothing to worry about. I was not naive enough to believe that. Marco's world was too complicated, too dangerous for such simple certainties. There would be challenges ahead, threats and betrayals, and moments when the cost of this life would seem too high. But sitting there in the golden evening with my husband beside me and my daughter's laughter floating through the windows, I understood something that had eluded me for 7 years. Safety was not the absence of danger. It was the presence of people worth facing danger for. It was belonging somewhere, to someone, in a way that made the risks worthwhile. I had walked into Marco Vitale's library as a maid with a secret and nothing to lose. I had walked out as something entirely different, something stronger, something braver, something that had been waiting inside me all along, needing only the right moment and the right person to finally emerge. His bodyguards were traitors. I told him the truth. And his response had indeed shocked me, but not in any way I could have anticipated. Not with punishment or dismissal. Not even with simple gratitude, with a future, with a family, with a love that had rebuilt me from the inside out. And in that, there was no shock at all, only the quiet certainty of coming home.